What's going on, everybody? This is Alex from the MTG Homebrew Network podcast, coming at you with a deck tech. It's my first one on the channel. I'm pretty excited. So you might be expecting a commander deck tech, because we've seen a couple of those on the channel before, but today I'm bringing you a tiny leaders deck tech. The first one for the channel. We're really breaking into the tiny leaders content, if you will, and I'm really excited. The deck I'm bringing to you today is super simple, super fun. If I'm ever at an event or at a gathering and someone says they have never played Tiny Leaders, this is the deck I give them. It is unbelievably simple to pilot, and it's just a great time. The deck is piloted by Jasmine Boreal of 7. She is a 3-mana human druid, 1 colorless, 1 green, and 1 white to cast. She is legendary. She taps to add 2 mana, 1 green, 1 white, and you can only use that mana to cast creatures with no abilities. Plus, creatures you control with no abilities can't be blocked by creatures with abilities. So when we say creatures with no abilities, we mean no abilities whatsoever. Keywords count as abilities. Anything with reminder text counts as abilities. So like this Alpine Grizzly right here, it's a 4/2 for 3. That's it. Doesn't do anything. That's the only kind of creature that Jasmine affects. And this deck has a lot of creatures. It is a heavy aggro deck. It is, you want to drop creatures, you want to swing with them. That is your game plan for defeating your opponent. The mana curve for this deck's creatures is super important. We're trying to get the best bang for our buck because our creatures are really only bodies. They're not doing a whole lot, so any wasted resources on too little attack power just doesn't cut it in this deck. We start at the bottom with cards like Elite Vanguard, which is 2 power or 1 mana. That's what we're looking for. 1 or more additional power per mana we're spending. So things like Isamaru, Hound of Khanda, is another 2 power creature for 1. Really good. We'd love to drop that on turn 1. The majority of these creatures are going to step into the 2 mana slot, 1 and another color usually, like Devilthorn Fox, Cliffhaven Sellsword, ton of those. The joke about this deck is it's almost all of the way to being a 2 mana 3/1 tribal. So 2 mana for 3 power on board, crazy good rate. By the time Jasmine's out and it's turn like 4, 5, 6, we can drop 3 of these a turn. That means we're swinging in with 9+ damage the following turn. These are the bread and butter of this deck. Additionally, you have some creatures at the top of the curve that are really nice, like Araska Frillback is 4 power for 3 mana. Leatherback Baloth is one of the best creatures in the deck. It's a 4/5 for 3 green, which is nuts. And you'll notice all these creatures, they don't have any toughness. They're not going to get blocked as long as Jasmine's out, because she says they can't be blocked by creatures with ability. So we don't really care how much toughness they have. They're usually not going to die unless it's to removal, or if someone is expending a lot of resources to remove Jasmine. So 2 of these creatures are exceptions to what we might think of as vanilla. They still are technically creatures with no abilities, but they're a little complicated. So for example, Shepherd the Flock here. It's still a 2 mana 3/1, but it's got its instant adventure side, which you can cast as an alternate sort of spell, send it on the adventure, and then you can cast it later. So technically the Usher to Safety part is only ever text on the card while that instant is on the stack. So that means that we can have this extra utility packed away in one of our creatures, but it still gets all the benefits of our commander. We have 2 of those. That is Shepherd of the Flock with its instant adventure Usher to Safety, where we can return something to our hand, namely Jasmine if she's getting targeted, or another one of our really good creatures or utility pieces if it's getting targeted with removal. The other one is Silver Flame Squire, which is a really handy buff spell for 3 mana, the instant. Target creature gets +2/+2 at the end of the turn, untap it. So that can be really good offensive if we're trying to close the win early, or it's really good defensive if we have like the Leatherback Baloth that already has a ton of toughness but needs a little bit extra to be able to block something or kill it or just prevent us from dying. So that's it for the 22 creatures, the bread and butter of the deck. Now we're going to go over to our spells. So we have 2 sorceries in the deck, Farseek and Rampant Growth. Both are ramp spells, both help us put lands on the battlefield that help us play things earlier, get ahead of our opponents and land advantage, or they can also thin out our deck and make sure there are less lands in there that we want to hit later in the game so we can draw the creatures we need to close out the win. I am always on the fence about playing ramp spells in Tiny Leaders because you are capped out at 3 mana, and a lot of times decks don't have the card draw support to balance out playing ramp spells. So a lot of times you'll run through a bunch of ramp spells, but then you're stuck with an empty hand and a lot of mana and nothing to use it for. I never run too many. I especially never run any at 3 mana. It just kind of feels bad using all or most of your turn just getting lands out and not actually affecting your board state. But then we're going to go over to the instants. So we've got Noxious Revival, one of my absolute favorite cards in the format. It belongs in every green deck ever in this format. It is way too good. It's a 1 Phyrexian symbol, so you can either pay it with 1 green mana or 2 life and no mana to put a card from a graveyard on top of its owner's library, and that is at instant speed. So for the low cost of 1 green or the even lower cost of 2 life, you can cast this at the end of your opponent's turn and return something they just removed with a removal spell or something you just blocked with to or some other really good spell right at the top of your library, ready for you to draw it in your next turn and have it to use. Got Path to Exile, really good removal spell in the format. You could also switch this out for a Swords to Plowshares. I kind of go back and forth. The life, it's kind of a bummer because this is a combat deck, so it it's kind of going against what we want to do, but giving your opponent a land, especially in this format, is dangerous sometimes, especially if you're using it to remove their Tiny Leader. Then that gets them much closer to casting it the next turn, especially if they're not on lands. It can help them a lot. And then Reclaim, just a Noxious Revival without the alternate cost, still incredibly good, really essential in this format, just to make sure, because with such a low mana cost, removal is so prime in Tiny Leader. You are talking about the most efficient removal and the most efficient way to protect yourself and your deck and your eventual win. And Recursion is the direct counter to that, getting all that stuff back that your opponents are working so hard to get rid of. Next, we're going to go into our artifacts, and here we're going to have a couple things that are good in this deck because of the way they're worded. So a lot of equipment is going to give our creatures like keywords, like if they say this creature has XYZ. That suddenly turns Jasmine off. They're able to be blocked. They're not as good to us. So things like Mask Memory, that doesn't give the equipped creature any abilities, but instead has a static ability that is only active when it is equipped. So whenever equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, you may draw 2 cards. If you do, discard 2 cards. Something like this, especially with the low cost of 2 and the really low equipped cost of 1, is super efficient and really good card draw for us. A lot of times when I'm playing this deck, I find that I just drop creatures and then I have nothing to do, because that is kind of the one thing the deck wants to do. So card draw in this deck, and really any Tiny Leaders deck, because there's not a ton of it, and you want to always be ahead of your opponent on options, your win cons, things like that. Mask of Memory is a really good choice, especially in an aggro deck, for good card draw. Same thing with Rogue's Gloves. It's very similar. Again, 2 mana, higher equipped cost at 2, but whenever a creature deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. So you don't have the choice of 2 cards, but you still get the same amount of cards in your hand. Still really good. And remember, all these creatures are unblockable. So as long as Jasmine's out, these are guaranteed triggers. Swiftfoot Boots, the only creature this ever goes on is Jasmine, as it gives the creature hexproof and haste, meaning that creature does not have no ability. But really good protection for Jasmine, because we want Jasmine to stick around. She doesn't do anything in the graveyard, she doesn't do anything in the command zone. We want her on the battlefield always. Next we're going to our enchantments. More card draw, because a ton of our creatures are cheap. We want to draw cards, we want to play them, we want to be quick moving with this deck. Fecundity, again, top of the curve at 3 mana. We don't have a ton of stuff up there, so it's got to be really good. This card is mainly for giving our opponents drawbacks to interacting with our things. So if Jasmine gets targeted or one of our bigger creatures gets targeted and dies, Fecundity says we draw a card for our troubles. And especially if Jasmine's really getting up in cost, she's getting removed a lot, her commander tax is built up, Fecundity is a really good way to give not as potent or not as absolute an ability as Jasmine, but rather a deterrent for our opponent's blocking. So, you know, if we're hellbent or we have 0 cards in hand and we're swinging in for like 2 or 3, 4 damage, that's not a ton. So our opponent might want to block and get rid of those creatures, or they might want to chump block, can't kill the creature. But then if our creature dies, because they all have such low toughness, remember, we draw a card, and that's, again, really, really good. It's just that extra layer of making our opponent's choices harder, so we make our lives easier. Incense, another one, really good rate at just 1 mana. It's a little more flimsy because it's an enchantment, so if the creature dies, that's gone. But again, deals combat damage to an opponent, draw a card. Super good. Doesn't give the creature abilities, so we are solid. Finally, we got our lands. This is super up to you. These cycling lands I find are really good in the format. In general, as long as you're in 2 or 1 colors, especially. You know, early game, you don't really mind dropping a tapped land because we're trying to be fast, but it's more important to have our colors and more important to get Jasmine out than getting things out early. Things like the Scattered Groves that taps for both, we don't really mind it coming in tapped. And if we're cycling it later, a card in the hand is much better than dropping a tapped land and having no plans for it. And yeah, outside of that, you know, it's really just getting all your colors. So if you build this deck a little differently, maybe a little more white, a little more green, this deck is fairly balanced, 50 to 45. So that's kind of how I have my lands, 3 forests, 2 plains, and, you know, it's kind of scattered within. Totally up to you. But yeah, this deck is a ton of fun. I hope you like it. Hope you get to play it at some point. Build your own version. There's not too many more vanilla creatures in Magic that have the same sort of power presentation that these do, but also in general, as with power creep and everything, Wizards is just printing less vanilla creatures these days. And when they do, they're still vanilla creatures, so they're not super duper good. But Anthems is another really fun way to play this deck. Stuff that gives creatures like plus something, you know, increased power and toughness, because they're gonna get big, but they still have no abilities, and they can just swing in for free with Jasmine. So yeah. Also, something I didn't talk about until now, which is crazy, her mana ability. Like dropping that on turn 3 and then suddenly going into turn 4 with 6 mana at least, plus you have colored mana that you can just get whenever if you want to cast your creatures. Really powerful. Just staying, like, you can get her out on turn 3 and you're dropping a land to go into your turn 4 with 6 mana. You're almost dropping your whole hand every turn 4 or 5. Like, it really doesn't get better than that. The fact that she's a mana dork and she can like just send in a ton of damage for free is incredibly powerful. Plus, you're not really attacking with Jasmine because you always want Jasmine to live, so you can always just tap her for mana. She's not really doing much else. For toughness is really good for a blocker, but again, Like, best offense is a good defense. This deck wants to play creatures, tapped, attacking. That's it. You have to wait a turn because they don't have haste, but that's okay. Yeah, so hope you like this video. Hopefully you get to play this deck. It's a ton of fun. Give it a shot. And if you do, or if you don't, head over to Discord and talk to us all about it. Tell me what you think about my deck, changes you'd make, and if you want to throw a game sometime. It's going to be linked in the description. Check out our other videos. More deck techs and things to come. Be excited, and take it easy.